Final thing we want to think about is the intensity of rivalry. Given the existing competitors within the industry, how intense is rivalry? Number of things to think about. The industry is more attractive when rivalry is less intense. One thing that is often difficult that I find that students to get their hands around is the fewer the number of competitors in the industry, the less rivalry is an issue. We all know of classic duopolies like Coke and Pepsi, and we want to say these are high rivalry situations because Coke and Pepsi are fighting for position. But think of the following. If there was a third competitor amongst Coke and Pepsi, would it be higher rivalry or less? To the idea of competition and competitive rivalry, it would be even higher. If you had another, even higher. The fact of the matter is a lot of small number industries, while they look like they have high rivalry as these companies jockey for position, are actually usually very, very attractive. Coke and Pepsi, great example, two very successful companies in a very small concentration market here in terms of the number of competitors. So the first thing we want to look at again is the number of competitors in the industry is small. There's a number of ways we can measure this. One way is simply, of course, trying to count the number of competitors. That's often very hard when you have a large distribution. The other things you want to think about are things like the concentration of firms in the industry. There's a number of ways we can measure that. One is what we call the Herfindahl index, which is the sum of the squares of the market shares of the firms in the industry. So in the extreme, in a monopoly where someone has 100% market share, that would be a 1, and you can imagine working down from there. We also sometimes look at the 4-firm concentration ratio, which would be the sum of the market shares from the 4 largest firms within an industry. So you look at something like the beer industry, you have a very large 4-firm concentration ratio amongst the mass-produced beer manufacturers. Other industries, take wine for example, the 4-firm concentration ratio is actually very, very low as it's a very distributed industry. Second thing you want to think about in terms of rivalry are what are the incentives to fight? In essence, what is the incentives for the 2 or more firms within the industry to be fighting with each other? And when we think of fight, probably the easiest thing to think about in terms of pricing, whether there'll be incentives to try to lower your prices to gain market share within the industry. So what are some of the things that push back on that? What are some of the things that push back on firms fighting for their lives by lowering their prices and ultimately destroying margins, as we talked about in our example with the t-shirt vendor in our last session? Well, one thing to think about is whether there's just simply substantial market growth. Basically saying this is a growing market opportunity and everybody can do well without having to be so aggressive in terms of pricing. This is especially important with various firms are capacity constrained. It's the idea again that even if I lower my prices, I can't meet the additional demand that I face, so I'm not incentivized to lower my prices. And as a result, we can all do well as the market continues to grow. This point about differentiation again. So opportunities to differentiate not only gives you more power over your buyers, but it also lowers some of the competitive threats within the industry, these threats to fight one another in terms of pricing and the like. You're basically kind of dividing up the market, if you will. Exit costs. Now here's kind of a somewhat of a catch-22. High exit costs increase the incentives to fight for potential entrants, which is a good thing for the industry, but they also increase the incentives to fight those within the industry, which is not an attractive thing. And so you have to kind of balance some of these forces here. So low exit costs lower the incentives to fight, and that's a positive for the industry. And then finally, little excess capacity here. And as we've said before, excess capacity can be a source of a barrier to entry because it gives you incentives to try to retaliate against potential entrants. But it has this flip side as well, that it might increase the competition within the industry as well. One thing to think about of why there is or is not excess capacity is to what degree is demand cyclical? Does the demand vary over different seasons of the year? Does the demand vary over the business cycle? Automobile manufacturers suffer from a strong relationship to the business cycle. When we go into recessions, most people can delay their auto purchases. As a result, we often have massive excess capacity during a downturn in the economy. As a result, auto companies often get very aggressive with pricing, giving various types of incentive programs and the like to try to get people to buy their products and services, which of course really hurts profitability in an industry. We can also think about cyclicality of demand over different types of seasons and the like. here in a college town, we have very high demand for hotel space, but in very limited times of the year. So one can imagine during the time of football games and during times like graduation, there is a very strong demand for hotel space in a college town. But yet on any given Tuesday, let's say in the middle of summer, demand is very low. As a result, there's very strong pricing pressure during those low demand periods there, and it makes it very hard to compete in those periods. Third thing to think about is the degree to which coordination is feasible here. There's a couple things to think about here. There's, of course, explicit price and market fixing, but I do not want to advocate this because in many situations, obviously, this is what we call an antitrust violation. You're not allowed to coordinate with your rivals to just simply try to hold prices high. So instead, we often talk about tacit coordination, various structural things that allow prices to stay higher. So what is this value of coordination? Well, let me just quickly run through some graphs here and a little bit of calculus as I did in our last session. Last session we talked about this idea of a price taker. We talked about the way to maximize profits is to take the derivative of our profit function and set it to zero. And we had a decision rule that said set quantity such that price equals marginal cost. Well, for a monopolist, it's a slightly different situation. As a monopolist, you not only get to choose your quantity, but you also get to choose your price. So the decision rule of marginal revenue equals marginal cost, if we take the derivative of the revenue and the derivative of cost and set them to equal zero, still holds. However, our equation is slightly different here in terms of what marginal revenue actually means. It doesn't actually mean price. It actually is this slightly more downward sloping demand curve that we see, or curve that we see on our chart here. So MC, once again, is marginal cost, AC is average cost, D is demand, MR is your marginal revenue. Decision rule set quantity such that marginal revenue equal marginal cost, but you charge the price that you can bear from the downward sloping demand curve. Basically what you see here is that you can be quite profitable, even more profitable as a monopolist than you would be in a competitive market. Not surprising, but here's just some of the calculus to illustrate that. So if you could coordinate, if you could act like a monopolist by coordinating with others, forming a cartel, for example, that can be very, very profitable. So there are examples of explicit price and market fixing. Cartels are these classic examples. You think about OPEC, the oil producing states that get together and try, in their case, to restrict supply as a way to raise prices and control prices. Why isn't this illegal? Well, it's not illegal because it doesn't fall into one jurisdiction or institutional area. In fact, this is often states, governments that are arguing to do this as a way to raise prices for those countries. Now, if you did that just within, for example, the US, this type of price fixing is illegal. We don't allow for discussions about pricing. In fact, we don't allow for discussions about what we call their functional equivalents. Let's say dividing up the country into different geographic domains where you compete in one versus the other. So these are just simply activities that are not allowed. It's not to say that there haven't been attempts. In fact, the airline industry, there was a famous attempt where the CEO of American Airlines at the time called up one of his competitors and basically in a explicitive tyrant on the on the answering machine said, raise your prices. This is simply not allowed, especially leaving that on the answering machine. This was found and brought to the attention of authorities there. Not a smart activity. The other thing to consider is that some actions are judged by the rule of reason, which says a balance between what are the competitive implications of this type of action versus are there other reasons that we would want to allow it from a kind of general welfare standard here. In recent years, there have been accused examples of price fixing. I think they're somewhat interesting. Many years ago, the Ivy League was accused of price fixing in terms of their financial aid packages because they were coordinating in terms of what they were giving for various students, in essence setting price for college. This was disallowed. And the U.S. airline industry has also been accused of this through their reservation systems in which they all pooled together information as a way, arguably, to try to coordinate on price. Once again, these are not allowed. What is allowed is various forms of tacit coordination. The challenge, of course, is these tacit coordination, this idea of we'll argue and hold prices high without actually talking to one another, is very difficult to maintain. It suffers from what we call in economics the prisoner's dilemma. It is simply the idea that if you had two prisoners who committed a crime together and you bring them into a cell and actually split them into two separate rooms, you try to get each of them to rat each other out. And the challenge, of course, is as the individual prisoners, is it would be better if you both keep your mouths shut and not rat each other out, but you're not sure if the other one is going to do that to you. And that incentive to basically do so leads both of them to basically finger the other one in terms of committing the crime. In terms of pricing, it's the same thing in that I'd like to keep my prices up, but I'm so worried that someone else will undercut me in price, it then devolves into a price war. There might, however, be structural factors that push back on this tendency to go to the lowest common denominator. The number of competitors, once again, just simply how many people are out there within the industry. The fewer there are, the more likely that prices might be able to stay a little higher. And this is our concentration ratio that I mentioned earlier. It can be a way of measuring this. Are there a few dominant competitors? Our Herfindahl index is a slightly better measure of this. If there's one dominant competitor, it might be the case that when they set prices, others simply follow. They know, they recognize them as the market leader, and as a result, follow their prices rather than trying to undercut them. One might look at McDonald's in the fast food industry, and then perhaps their competitors watch them and see how they price. And finally, there's this notion of similarity in competitors. The more similar competitors are within an industry in terms of their background, their history, and the like, there might just somewhat be an understanding of what the going market price is in a given market. And that might be a way that prices stay high. Third thing to think about are these facilitating devices. There's actually different strategic ways in which firms might try to hold prices up. Very counterintuitively, there's even been those who suggest that the threat of price wars is in itself a way actually to keep prices up. There's a strategy that's referred to as tit for tat, that will keep our prices up, but as one firm starts to cut their prices, we all cut in punishment, but then we bring them back up again, and everyone goes back to a more stable and more a better position in terms of pricing. If you think about airline price wars, they often have this dynamic where one firm will cut prices in an attempt to increase demand, others will respond in kind, there's suddenly a price war, your friend's calling you on the phone and saying, now's the time to get those tickets. Eventually the prices creep back up, however. Interesting question, or an interesting point perhaps. And then finally there are things like best price clauses. It says things like, I will meet any of my competitors' prices here in terms, let's say, of electronics retailer. What those best price clauses might do is it might discourage your rivals from trying to undercut you in price, and then everybody keeps prices higher as a result. So once again, there are some of these facilitating devices. They don't always work, but they may be a way to increase the tacit coordination with an industry, keeping prices higher and undermining some of the rivalry that will make an industry less profitable.